so many special things have happened to me doing this, and so many people have been so kind to me that I sometimes try to evoke an out-of-body experience and stand on the other side of the room and look back, and because I have the feeling, are you people talking to me? Is it me that you're treating in such a warm and gracious manner? Because I'm nobody special, and so many folks treat me like I'm special, and I always keep a firm grip on they're talking and working with General or President Grant. When I'm in uniform or in my presidential suit, it's not Curt Fields here. It's people looking at and listening to Grant, and that is my fundamental approach to it. Ego doesn't get into it. Quite the opposite. I'm astonished at the cascade of blessings that have poured upon me in the last 11 years.
So you can see here that about 45% say yes, they've thought about it at least. 40% say no, and 15% say, "Are you nuts?"
Well, I would, before we move on from that topic, I would strongly encourage anyone who wants to do a historical first-person impression to do it. There's no end to the joy that comes out of it. It's more than pleasure. It's joy that you get from it. And find somebody that you think a lot of, that you like, and learn about them, and you can portray them. The caveat is, and I'm an example, and it's how I got into it, and I'll address that more fully, but the caveat is if you're going to pick somebody well-known, obscure, like Judith Benjamin, he's somebody that was absolutely key in the Confederacy. And he is, if you read his story, there are a few books out on Judith Benjamin. He is a fascinating man who survived the war and wound up being an extremely, Daz and Ray and Bob and Michelle can ring in, and Sam Hindle, and I think agree with this heartily, that Benjamin beat the Federals before they could get him. He got to England, read law, became a barrister over there, and actually wrote some books on, I think, maritime British law that are still quoted and in use. And who knows anything about Judith Benjamin beyond us hardcore folks? So if you're going to pick somebody like Benjamin, you could do a great service by putting Judith Benjamin in front of people and saying, "I'm Judith Benjamin. I'm a Jew. I'm the only Jew in the Confederate government, and I think in the federal government." And he held every cabinet position in the Confederacy except the postmaster. And the postmaster is John Reagan, who was from Tennessee. The Confederate post office was the only money-making successful enterprise in the entire Confederate government, run by John Reagan, who was living in Texas. See, a man could do John Reagan and put out all kinds of information and in a reenactment or at an event, and people will leave the better for your portrayal, and you'll get that head shaking. Well, I sure didn't know that, as you talk about John Reagan. Emily Lapisardi who lives in West Point or near West Point. Emily has just come out with a book. She's annotated Rose Greenhow's biography that was written. Now Rose has annotated it, and it's on sale. Rose does Emily Lapisardi. Well, not many, Emily Lapisardi does Rose Greenhow, and not many people know about Rose Greenhow, but when you watch Emily do a presentation, a person who's been obscure is lifted into the forefront. So ladies, if you want to do a portrayal, MJ Henyon does Major Pauline Cushman. I think she's with us tonight. I hope so. But MJ Henyon does Major Pauline Cushman, who became a commissioned officer and a major and was a spy. So if you want to do somebody, but I want to remind, as I wrap that up, if you pick somebody well known, like I did, you need to, if you can, have some resemblance to them. Because people, if you do Lincoln and Jerry Payne does a great job. I've worked with him. If you do Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or a famous federal general, you need, if you can, pick somebody that you physically resemble, because your portrayal then will be more believable. But if you pick somebody like Judith Benjamin or someone that's not well known who was key, and there are many, male and female, then you do a real service to history and to people coming to these events, and you'll have a wonderful time. Can encourage you more to do a living history portrayal. And that leads me into, how did I get into this? And I have been asked that many times, and it's always a pleasure to talk about it. This picture that you're looking at was taken in 2008 at the 145th of the Battle of Chickamauga. And I got off the bus there, went up there with a tour group, and I had never been a reenactor. I had never wanted to be a reenactor. Those guys and women work hard, and I never really had any desire. So I got off the bus, and I immediately met Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, and Jeb Stuart. And all of them were appropriately, accurately uniformed and were most impressive. And then I saw this man that you're looking at. He's Dennis Boggs. Dennis lives in Nashville and has been doing Lincoln for 25 or 30 years. He's an excellent Lincoln. And he's a body double for Lincoln, and I'm a body double for Grant, and thereby hangs the tale. I had a God thing happen. It was really an epiphany, because I'd seen Lee, Jackson, Stewart, and Longstreet, and about 100 feet behind them was this man under his tent fly. And like everybody does at an event or a reenactment, I said, Mr. President, and because most people who go to an event, they'll get in the spirit of what you're doing. And I addressed him appropriately, I thought. Mr. President, may I have a photograph with you? And he said, why, sure. And he had that Lincoln-esque, as does Jerry Payne, that Lincoln-esque demeanor and persona. And when he did this, Lena took the picture that I still got. And at that moment that you're looking at, I have a God thing happen, because in a nanosecond, I thought of everything I'm about to tell all of you. I thought when he did that, put his hand on my shoulder, wow, what a photo op. Because Grant is the most photographed man in the 19th century. There are more than 400 photos of Grant or Grant with somebody else. He's around the globe. He's the most photographed man in the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln is the third most photographed man in the 19th century. And I know you're wondering, and I'll tell you, Frederick Douglass came in at number 2. But I thought, I'm a body double for Grant. I weigh 150, 55 pounds. It varies. Well, it goes down lower than that sometimes, but I weigh what he weighed. I am his height. I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall, and I've got his body style. I don't have a big backside. I don't have a big gut. I don't have broad shoulders. I have a medium build like he did. I'm a body double for Grant. Lincoln, there is a body double for Lincoln, Dennis Boggs for Lincoln. And even though Grant and Lincoln were what they were to each other, they were the team that won the war, there was never a photograph of them together. Not one. There are a lot of drawings, pictures, and paintings, but there's not a single photograph of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant together. So what a photo op. I wonder if I were to grow a beard and put on a Yankee uniform, if I could look like Grant. Now, I thought of all of that in about 0.5 seconds. And then I shook my head and I thought, wow, where did all of that come from? Well, I'll tell you, all my life, I've been an avid reader. And my first love when I could read, and I can't remember when I couldn't read, because my father was an 8th grade dropout truck driver. And mother dropped out of her senior year. She later got a GED when she was 55. But those two people are exemplary, that you don't have to have a degree to prove you're smart. And I'll testify, you can have a degree and daily prove you're not smart. But mother and dad were both heavy readers. So my earliest memory of dad is when I'm about 3 or 4 years old, and my 15-month younger brother, we're both sitting in dad's lap. Now, we're small enough that I'm on one leg and my brother's on the other leg, and we're both holding up the paper, the comics, Sunday comics, because they were in color. And dad was reading the words and pointing out the words as he read them to us. Now, that's the best. I'm a retired high school principal. And I'll tell you, with a career in education, that's the best kind of teaching that can be done. Because what was dad doing unknowingly? He was pointing out words, so we're getting word recognition. He's sounding the words, so not only are we recognizing what those little symbols, those letters mean when you put them together, but we're learning how you say them, word attack. And he did that for as long as we were both small enough to sit in his lap, 3 or 4 years. So with that, I developed an early love for reading, and I can't remember when I couldn't read. Well, then I got into, at about age 10 to 12, like everybody else, I came across the American Heritage big books with those wonderful maps with the little blue and gray soldiers. And I still got it, one of them. And I read Bruce Catton. And Bruce Catton is the gateway reader for no telling how many millions of people. So I early developed a real passion for the Civil War. And I'm a native of Memphis, Tennessee. And even though I grew up in the South, I never had any problem with the South losing, because I feel that providentially the South should have lost the war. But my focus, my interest has always been on the men who fought the war and what they did and how they did it. It's the story of the war, the hundreds of thousands of stories of the war that caught me up at an early age. So I'd read everything about the war that couldn't outrun me. So by the time I get here to 2008, I've got a pretty good base knowledge. You know, as all of you tonight watching, every one of you probably has, if you're watching this program, and many of you have been with us throughout the series, you've got a good base knowledge, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't. And in my poor efforts, I try to help you with that. I don't think I contribute much, but you've got a good base. So I came into it with a good base. With Grant, I'd always been all right with Grant. I didn't have anything special for Ulysses S. Grant. No, sir. But I didn't dislike him. I didn't have any anti-Grant feelings. I knew who he was, and I had a respect for what he did. He ultimately was the prevailing officer. So I had no problems with being from the South and doing Grant. I walked away from that event, and I told Lena, something really strange just happened to me. I mean, I feel like Saul on the road to Tarsus here. Something bizarre has happened. And I told her, I said, I asked her, do you think I could look like Grant if I was to grow a beard and put on a Yankee uniform? And Lena, in her inimitable way, said, do it. So I had the acid test. I've got two longtime reenactors, and let me emphasize here, I had never had a desire to be a reenactor. God bless reenactors, for they shall show us what it sounded like and looked like. When you think of films like Gettysburg, that, of course, we all default to Gettysburg because we should. It's the foundation for reenactors. That's when movie producers and directors discovered, if you want a Civil War movie done well, call the local reenactors, put out the word, because you don't have to worry about proper costumes. You don't have to worry about people showing up. You don't have to worry about them following directions, because all you've got to do is tell this reenacting group, go over yonder and stand there until we tell you to, and they'll be there all day. That's who we are. I consider myself under the tent or in the tent with reenactors. I'm a living historian. And people say, well, what's the difference? To me, fundamentally, or the difference is that I can be anywhere. The last 2 years I was in Ulysses during February. Grant was not at Ulysses, but I can do presentations anywhere that I wasn't and talk about what was going on where I was, to give people an overall perspective of what was happening in the war. And they also people in Florida got to visit and talk and see and hear General Grant for 2 years. And they were the better for that, I think, I hope. So a living historian can be anywhere at any time, even whether or not he or she was there. And the living historian, see, I don't go out on the field and command troops. I don't purport to, I don't want to, because to command troops on the field, you've got to earn that. You've got to have come up through the ranks and learned your craft. The men who are out there commanding troops on a battlefield are very knowledgeable, and it's their job that they've learned and earned. Now, I'm proud to tell you that on 3 different occasions, I have been approached and offered to lead troops in combat in a battle. And I have always graciously, I hope, thanked the officer that offered me that honor and declined and said, you've honored me, but I don't have any business out there leading your men across that field. I haven't earned that right. And I don't know what to do out there. I'm the guy that's in the tent or on the stage who is putting forth General Grant and talking about what's happening here or what I was doing over yonder while you folks were here. Now, that's a living historian. The reenactors put on that wool and hump that heavy rifle and all the accoutrements and live a hard life during a reenactment. But when I had this epiphany there at Chickamauga, I called my 2 friends, and one of them will galvanize. He'll do Federal or Confederate. The other one will not galvanize. He does only Confederate. He has very strong feelings, and he said, I just do Confederate. But I called both of these fellas, and I said, I want to do something, but I won't do it unless both of you, whom I respect greatly as reenactors, tell me you think I can do it. And they both said, yeah, sure, Curt, what do you want to do? And I said, I can't tell you. Can't tell you. Because if I tell you, I'll be throwing a dead rat in the well and poison or poison the waters. It might influence you. Okay, when do you want to do it? I said, give me a month. And I grew the beard and I rented a horrendous costume. The only thing I could get was at a local costume shop, and it was ghastly, but it was close enough. Called my 2 buddies, went over to them, and they both were enthusiastic, and they said, yeah, you can do this. And I said, who am I? And they said, well, you're Grant. I said, good. I can go with it now. And of course, both of them said, but why Grant? Particularly the one that won't galvanize. And I said, duh. I'm 5'8", I'm 150 pounds. I body style, build, I resemble him. And we talked initially they said, well, why don't you do a Confederate general? And talked initially a great deal about possibly doing Patrick Cleburne. And I gave that some thought. And I'll tell you after a bit why I decided not to do Cleburne, who I greatly admire, the Stone Wall of the West. I've been to his gravesite several times in Helena, Arkansas. But they said, you can do it. And I had the blessing of reenactors, very experienced reenactors, and decided to do it. But then I had another hurdle because I had decided I'm going to do Grant in first person and take advantage of the physicality and the resemblance. Well, as I said, I had a pretty good reading base, but if I'm going to speak as Grant, I've got to know Grant. I've got to know what Grant said or what people said about Grant. So I read his memoirs. I spent all of 2009 reading everything on Grant I could get. I read his memoirs. I read the parallel books about him, Catton books, and got as prepared as I could. And I made my first appearance as Grant actually I was at Shiloh in 2010, late 2009. And didn't do anything as Grant, but I was there. I appeared as Grant in February of 2010. And I'll talk about that experience briefly and then move on to more questions. But I had been invited there. I have never gone anywhere I was not invited, and will not go anywhere that I'm not invited. So they knew I was there. They'd asked me to come up. There's a community dance period ball held before the weekend of the reenactment. And Lena got a dress, which turned out to be horrendous. But she at that time did not know what was appropriate. It looked okay. And I've even got a picture of that. We were dancing a dance, and I've got a picture of that too, but I don't have it for this evening. And when we got there, the organizers knew we were coming. But when we got there, we walked in, and there were 150 people in the room, community center, and the band's playing. And the band stopped playing. They finished a song, and a wave of silence went across the room. And they all turned and looked at Brigadier General Grant. Donaldson's the only place that I can wear a 1-star, the Brigadier General uniform. I can't wear it anywhere else because he was promoted after that on February the 18th. But silence rolled across, just washed across the room. And they told us where we could sit, our table. And so Lena and I began to walk over to the table, and the crowd parted. It was like Moses parting the Red Sea. And it was total silence. And then the murmuring about they look good, I'm glad Grant's here, and so forth, began to ripple through the crowd. But when they parted, I thought, there may be something to this. I don't know. It astonished me. And people spent the evening coming up and thanking me for coming and saying we're glad to have a Grant here and so forth. And then I was invited to do the Grant for the 150th of Donaldson in 2012. My career, I've been so richly blessed. My career took off very quickly. And I went from doing Grant beginning in February of 2010 to being the Grant for the 150th for Fort Donaldson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Appomattox. I've been richly blessed and have had success as Grant. But that's how I got into it. Now about Cleburne, before I move on, because that's important. I went to my two friends and I said, I'm not going to do Cleburne. I'm only going to do Grant. As much as I admire Patrick Cleburne, or Cleburne as you really should say it, I'm not going to do him. Why not? Because there are 3 reasons. One is because I can't do the intensive, in-depth reading about another person that I'm having to do for Grant, that I'm compelled to do for Grant, because I'm not a fill-in-the-blank historian. If you ask me something and I don't know it, I'll tell you I don't know it. And that's more research to do to get back with you. But to be able to speak with confidence as Grant, say what he said or what he would have said, given what he said about other issues, I had to focus on Grant. It's a lifetime job. And I can't do that much reading on somebody else. And the other reason, second reason, was I don't want to diffuse what I'm doing. I don't want you to come and see me at an event and I'm Ulysses S. Grant. And then some weeks, months later, you go to another event and I'm Patrick Klaber. And then you start saying, but weren't you Grant? And now you're, and immediately I become an actor instead of a living historian. I do different roles. Now, there are a lot of folks that do different roles, and I admire them. I am not criticizing that, but you're more of an actor if you do multiple roles than if you do one role. And I want to be like GM Trucks, do one thing and do it well. And the third reason, I bought that uniform. And I thought, I really don't want to have to buy another uniform, accurate uniform, and do that all over again financially. And as it turns out, now I've got many more uniforms. It happens over the years. So that's how I got into it. That's why I got into it, and the what I do to maintain doing it. What questions would you have of me now?
I have a bunch of questions here, Curt. First off, Karen says Lou Ayres was the lead actor in the earlier movie.
Lou Ayres, and he was a conscientious objector in World War II and had a really bad time, but he went in and he became a decorated combat doc in Europe. Oh yeah, Lou came through. Once he said, I'll serve my country. I want to serve my country, but I will not carry a gun and kill anybody. I will be a medic. And so, see, that's the second half of the story that people never hear. He distinguished himself as a combat medic during World War II in Europe. Proceed.
Incredible. Kathy says many books have been published in the last few years about World War I because of the 100th anniversary of the battles. MJ says, good evening, everyone. Major Cushman from upstate New York.
Major Cushman, so glad you could join us. I hope that we have an opportunity to meet someday.
Art Barwick says, hello, good evening to all from Ray in Southampton, UK.
Ray, thank you for coming. You graced the program. Thank you so much.
And Fernando says, good evening.
The South American, Venezuelan, thank you for coming.
And Mike Hoover asks, Curt, what was the most difficult thing to overcome to become Grant? And did you spend a lot of mirror time?
I spent no mirror time. The hardest thing to overcome, and I'm pleased to tell you, Mike, and to tell everybody, the hardest thing that I had to overcome was the accent, which in the reality is not an accent. Now, initially, I grew up in Memphis and I am a Southerner, and it comes through in my voice. I do not, and I've been asked many times, well, do you use an accent when you are Grant? No, because I'm not going to purport to be something I'm not. And if I start trying to do an accent, and I greatly admire actors who do not have an accent when their native tongue is with an accent, I would wind up concentrating more on how I'm saying instead of what I'm saying. And I had several people, not many, but I had several people say, well, you can't be Grant. You talk like you're from the South. You ain't Grant. I actually had somebody tell me that once. And I had a couple of people from upper Wisconsin near the Canadian border who really challenged me. They meant well. They really challenged me. You're not Grant. And they had such a northern accent, I couldn't understand them. And I said, well, everybody sounds like an accent to you people. Listen to you. And I started to ask people, and they said, you can't be Grant. You got a southern accent. I said, well, what did Grant sound like? And there's always silence. And I said, well, tell me, and I'm not challenging you. I'd like to know. You're telling me I don't sound like Grant. What did Grant sound like? Can you tell me? Is there a recording I can go hear? Well, I said, now see, I've made a point here, and I always tried to soothe if there were hurt feelings. Nobody knows what Grant actually sounded like. Now, Grant's described as speaking in measured terms, and if you listen to me in presentations, you'll hear this. It's the only thing I really do that's not me, although it really is pretty much me. But Grant spoke in measured phrases, in a baritone voice. He spoke softly and had the most melodious voice I ever heard. I truly enjoyed listening to him speak. And that's several different men saying that. And I fit, now being melodious, I don't know so much about that, but that's how I speak. I've got a deep voice and I speak usually in measured phrases, but that comes from being a career educator. You have to speak with some deliberateness in your voice to get across a point, and so on and so forth. So I was never sensitive about having what I consider to be something of a Southern accent, but didn't worry about it until I became the official grant for the Ulysses S. Grant Boyhood Home in Georgetown, Ohio. And they did a national search, and I'm so honored they chose me. So the first time I went up there to meet with all of them, spent a couple of days. They're wonderful people in Georgetown. Everyone should make a pilgrimage. If you're a Grant fan or a Civil War fan, make a pilgrimage to the Boyhood Home in Georgetown, Ohio, and where he was born, Point Pleasant, Ohio, miles away from where he grew up, and to the Grant Cottage up in Saratoga, New York. But I spent the 2 days there at the Grant home in Georgetown, Ohio, and it was hail fellow well met, and everybody was happy. But I did notice there that these people don't sound like they have a northern inflection in their voice. And like somebody for maybe New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, somebody that might have as much of a northern accent as southern accent. Now, you get the southern accent from eating barbecue and drinking out of Dixie cups. But if you'll stay away from those two things, you won't get so much of the accent. But I heard something, I didn't hear something I was expecting to hear. No northern accent. And again, I asked myself, well, what does a northerner sound like? And I reversed the question and gave it some thought. And I thought, well, I don't know. But here, I'm not hearing it. And when I left, Dr. Ned Lodwick, Ned's a retired, well, semi-retired veterinarian, and he grew up in Brown County, Georgetown, Ohio County. And the last, when I was getting in the truck, he said, Curt, I need to tell you something. Before you go, I've got to tell you something. I said, well, I was expecting something of moment then. And I thought, oh, man, don't tell me you've changed. You've met me and you've changed your mind. You don't want me. But he said, I've been listening to you. I talked to you on the phone several times, and I've been around you for 2 days now. And I've got to tell you, you sound just like I've always thought Grant would sound like. And I said, you're kidding. And he said, no, absolutely not. That would be a good response for you, expected. But he said, I'm not kidding. And I said, okay. He said, so don't be concerned about an accent. You sound like a person from Brown County. And then he told me about, think about it. Brown County, Georgetown, Ohio, was founded in 1821. the year before Grant was born. It's in, if you look at a map of Ohio, this looks like Ohio. And here's Cincinnati. Georgetown is down here. Georgetown is just about the southernmost part of the north part of the country above the Mason-Dixon line. If you look at the map at the Mason-Dixon line, Grant, in fact, Georgetown is almost on the same parallel as Richmond over in the east. So he grew up, if he'd fallen out his front door, he'd have fallen in Kentucky. And Georgetown was founded by a contingent of Kentuckians who did not want to live in a slave state. They moved across the Ohio River and went about 10 miles inland and stopped and formed the village of Georgetown, Ohio. So Georgetown, that Grant grew up in for 17 years, he moved there when he was 11 months old. So from age 2 through age 17, he grew up in a community founded and peopled primarily Kentuckians. And the people that weren't Kentuckians were from Western Pennsylvania. Both of his parents had come down, migrated from Western Pennsylvania. So he's even described, one of his biographers of the period, an 1860s, late 60s book, said that General Grant has the intonations of voice of a Southerner, yes, even the expressions and mannerisms of a person from the South. So what you hear me saying is how he sounded. He had a Southern accent. And then Ned went on to say, now think about it. He grew up here around Kentuckians. He was making runs to Maysville, Kentucky, across the river. He went to school in Maysville, Kentucky for 2 years. He was making trips to Louisville, Kentucky. The furthest he went was Blue Springs, Kentucky. So he spent his life either around Kentuckians or in Kentucky. And then he went to the academy. The academy was at least 50% Southern soldiers, students. And when he leaves the academy, he goes to St. Louis. Then he goes to Mexico. And then he comes back to St. Louis. And so the sound of my voice is buoyancy neutral. For last year on the river, one of the riverboat cruises where I was a historian on the boat, a guest on the boat, we ran into a family from Brown County, and I was having this conversation because the man said, "You sound like you grew up in Brown County," and that was no prompting from me. So I told him the story. He said, "Oh no, don't ever take that from anybody. I grew up in Brown County. You sound like you're from where you grew up." So that's the story behind my voice and what I say or how I say when I'm Grant.
All right. So Rex would like to know, how many uniforms do you have?
As he laughs, I have got a brigadier general, a 1-star, a major general combat outfit, the one that you see me most of the time wearing. It's the first uniform I bought back in 2009. And now it's sun bleached and it's dirty. It's not ragged. I have gone through a pair of trousers. The seat came out of the trousers, so I had to replace the trousers. But I've got a combat 2-star major general. I've got a dress 2-star major general for when I'm at an event or something that I was that rank at that place or time. And it's an inside thing or it's a more formal, so I look nice in the 2-star major general. So brigadier general, 2-star major general combat, 2-star major general dress, lieutenant general, and combat to be in the field in the daytime, a 2-star or 3-star lieutenant general dress that stays in the closet except for formal occasions, and a 4-star general of the Army, and a waistcoat for 4 of those. For each one of them, I've got a waistcoat to match. So I've got 5 uniforms, I guess, altogether. And I've got a colonel uniform, Colonel Grant. So 5 or 6.
So Michelle would like to know, have you ever opened the door to trick-or-treaters as General Grant?
No, I haven't. I thought about it. I thought about it. I haven't though because Lena had suggested it, and I said, "Well, I'd like to do that, but I don't want to do Grant if you don't do Julia."
Ooh.
And she said, "Well, I don't want to put on that corset and lace up and dress up to do that just for trick or treaters." And I said, "Well, then if you won't, I won't." That's why.
So John would like to know, Curt, how long have you been using Zoom presentations, and was your first experience with it as frustrating as mine?
I've been using Zoom for a year, and I have not. No, the first one was not a problem, and I haven't had any problem. The only problems I've ever had was a communal thing with Mike and myself here. We did one program, Mike, that there were some difficulties that and it was not your fault. There was something going on there where you live. I think power outage or something
Right.
in the area, and so it was circumstances beyond your control. Haven't had a problem. Now I've had a Skype account. I had one for about 10 years. I would love to get into schools because I'd love to get into a situation where a social studies class or department in a high school or elementary school could book me to come in, and I can talk for an hour, give them an hour, and tell them you can get all the kids you want to in the school. It doesn't matter to me. Put me on a screen in a big room in the auditorium and let me do Grant, and I'll do Q&A. And I still love to do that. But I never got an in or how to figure out how to contact social studies departments. And I never had a compelling reason to do the Skype, and I finally canceled the account. Well, when the pandemic lockdown came in, we were, General McClellan, he's late, isn't he?
Oh yeah.
No, he's close. And for those of you that don't know why I call the clock General McClellan, he's a Napoleon style clock, and of course it would be. And he's supposed to be a 31-day clock, and I have to wind him every week. And he always runs a little slow. So I got a Napoleon clock that needs more winding than he ought to, and he always runs slow. You know, I don't know why, but I thought of George McClellan with those three factors. So I've named it General McClellan. But with the Zoom, last appearance I made was March 13th of last. And about, I think, September, I was approached with, would you do a Zoom and for our Civil War Roundtable? And I said, sure, be happy to. And then more came in, and I have gotten into doing a lot of Zoom presentations, and not just Zoom, but hybrid, where I've been in a meeting like in Southwest Michigan. I did in St. Joseph, Michigan. I've been to those folks. They're wonderful folks up there. I think I hold the record. I'm the speaker before them most. 5 or 6 times, and I'm booked again in September. But I was there with the screen like now. I had a screen on a stand in front of me, and there were 40, 50 people in the room, and there were that many people at home, and I took Q&A like we're doing now. So I've done hybrid where I've been in the room with people and those at home, and I've been here with people in the room and those at home. So I've done both ways of Zoom. The compelling reason was thrust upon me. You know, Shakespeare said some men are born with greatness, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Well, I had Zoom thrust upon me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because now, look at us now. There's 120 folks around the world. Now, that's enough to stagger me. But there are 120 folks across America, into Canada, Fernando in Venezuela, Daz and Ray and Bob and Michelle over in the UK. I think I got 1 or 2 in Australia. Got friends down there. So this is a marvel to me, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And I see the future going forward. I'll be doing a lot of this, and it makes it affordable because people Well, and I was the Scottsdale club. I spoke to them, and instead of having to pay expenses to get me out to Scottsdale, we do it on Zoom, and it saves a lot of money. It's like a Geico commercial. You save a ton of money going through the Zoom route. No, it's not as good as me being in the room with you. No, it doesn't feel as good to me as being in the room with you. But if we can get the word out and people still get to see and enjoy their history in a positive manner, it's a win-win for everybody. So I've never had a problem with it. It's always been a good experience, and I see it becoming a firm part of my Grant portrayal into the future.
So I think that we covered Roger's question about why you chose General Grant. And Jerry says, thinking of you as General Grant, Curt, I am wishing you a happy birthday next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Many happy returns. Karen says, Curt, first, love your accent. As a Southern gentleman, you aren't you from Oklahoma. How did you get interested in portraying General Grant, and why not a Confederate general? And how long did you work on studying Grant? And finally, are you still finding out new things to learn about Grant?
Well, a recap to answer the question, and because I went through that in great detail, but I became interested in Grant from age 10, I guess, if not younger, interest in the Civil War, and Grant and Lee, of course, surfaced. And when I found out that I'm a body double for General Grant, see, if you look at me, when I've got the uniform on or the presidential suit, when you look at me, I'm doing a service. I don't have to open my mouth, because when you look at me, you're looking at him. I've had countless people tell me, you can't be Grant, you're not tall enough. You ain't big enough. And I say, au contraire, read your books. It says he was 5'8", and he weighed about 100, well, in the war, 135 to 160 pounds. The famous tree shot where he's leaning on the tree there at right after Cold Harbor, look at his uniform. His waistcoat is tightly buttoned, and it's almost, what is it, convex going in. He is about 135 to 140 pounds when that picture was taken. And because he'd been on, that's June 5th, excuse me, 4th, 5th, or 6th, right after Cold Harbor. And they've been in combat constantly since May the 5th. So he's been in the field in combat night and day for 5 weeks at that time. And so he's down to a nub. Although I'll tell you that after I've done, a lot of people, when they see me, they say, go lean on a tree. That's his most iconic shot. And it's an intrinsic thing with me, because it's strange. The Twilight Zone music should go off in the background, because ever since I did that picture, every time I walk past a tree, I've got this irresistible urge to go lean on it. And I don't understand. I just don't understand. But I have a physical resemblance to Grant. I have been doing him I've been beginning my 12th year. I read like a madman for 2009, read his memoirs, read some other things, and it's an ongoing thing. I read something Grant almost every day. I'm always learning new things. For example, Grant wore a size 9 shoe. I found that out just within the last couple of months. He wore a size 9 shoe. Like his favorite dessert was lemon cookies or sugar cookies, or bread pudding. He liked bread pudding. His favorite breakfast was sliced cucumbers dipped in very cold pickle brine. He wouldn't eat anything that walked on 2 legs. He refused to eat anything that walked on 2 legs, which is anything with feathers. And he had a sense of humor. Grant had a really good sense of humor, but you never hear that. I've only found one reference to that, but it said Grant, behind closed doors with friends and family, was considered the life of the party. Now, the first time I read that, I thought, if you're going to a party where U.S. Grant is the life of the party, perhaps you should go to another party. But as I've read about Grant, the overall, you got weather, which is every day, and you got climate, which is all year. As I read enough of the weather, the climate became obvious, and Grant had a great sense of humor and loved a joke. So I'm always learning something about him. And I long ago gave up. Well, I sure didn't know that, but I now feel like, wow, found another diamond, another nugget lying on the ground that I can share with people. Just like Thursday night at Hampton Roads, I told them I'm 5'8", got blue eyes, weigh 150 pounds, and I wear a size 9 shoe. And I had people looking at each other quizzically, and I said, yes, indeed. I am. I'm frequently asked, what size shoe do you wear, General? Wore a size 9. So little things like that greatly spice the persona as you are presenting it to people. So I hope I've answered all your questions. And I read almost daily something about Grant.
Art Barwick says, do you ever break your first person character when speaking as Grant?
Well, that's Ray. Her name is R-A-E.
Oh, okay.
It's Ray Barwick. No, I do not break character. No, sir. No, ma'am. I do not break character. I do not make any allusions. I might slyly say something. For example, Thursday night at Hampton Roads, and I do this almost every time I make a presentation if I can, because they were wanting the program General Grant, the Man Behind the Uniform, and I was able to go like a free range chicken with that and just go everywhere. And I wound up talking to them for 2 hours. It was wonderful. I said, journalists, that someone asked me a question about Sherman and about was he successful and so forth. And I told some insight on that. And I said, Sherman was pilloried by the journalists, and they had no integrity. And I certainly hope that goes away and heals itself and journalists acquire integrity. Of course, that sent a ripple of laughter through the room. And that's as close. See, I can say something in period, and people in the audience may interpret it in the present day, and the humor will echo from, as it did with Hampton Roads in that particular incident, from 1861 or 62 to 2021. But I don't make references to anything modern. When people ask me questions about politics, I always tell them, I know not of what you ask, because if it happened after July 23rd of 1885, I don't know anything about it and cannot address it. And that diplomatically ends it for me, and it doesn't hurt anybody's feelings, and they don't feel offended. So no, ma'am, Ray, I don't ever break character, never. And I don't really break character much at all, anytime.
So Jerry would like to know, from your first portrayal as Grant at Fort Donelson in 2010, at that time, how long do you think that you'd be doing this?
That was open-ended for me, Jerry. I didn't give any thought to that because I didn't know how it would go over. And fortunately, I was blessed. I had been well received, and the opportunities keep coming. Now, how long will I do Grant? I'm going to do Grant as long as I possibly can. As long as I can stand up and deliver, I'm going to do Grant. And if I get to where I can't do Grant as Grant, I will do about Grant, because the story can be told as long as I have a believable appearance as Ulysses S. Grant or President Grant. I'm going to do Grant, and I don't see it ending, even in these turbulent times. When the Civil War history is taking a beating, I think we will prevail. People like all of you folks who you not only bless me and grace me with your, humble me with your presence, but you are also stalwarts in the preservation of history, because it's people like each and every one of you. And Mike Mobius, who's doing things like the Civil War Roundtable Congress. Mike is a guy that came out of nowhere and said, hey, let's do a national organization. Well, this thing's taken off. And what Mike is doing is breathing new life into roundtables all over the country. And they're closing all over the country. But we can reverse that and staunch that flow. So I don't see it ending. And as long as we got people like each one of you folks out there listening and watching tonight, it's not going anywhere. Now, we may have a little reshaping. We may have a little shakedown, you know, but we will be a phoenix that will emerge from the flames of an assault on history, and we will prevail.
All right. Daz says hello. When,
oh, Daz.
When did you look in the mirror and realize that you looked like the great man himself?
I never did that. I grew the beard, and I'll tell you this. I've never told anybody that I look like Grant. I will tell you I resemble Grant, particularly head to toe in the physical image person that you see. I'm a dead ringer for Grant for that. And I've got the hair and the beard to match. And sometimes, I hear the gamut. Some people say, oh, you look just like the man. Oh, it's eerie. You look just like the man. And some people have said, nah, you don't look anything like him at all. Yeah, ain't Grant. Go away. Get out of here. So it runs the gamut. Fortunately, more people say I do than a minority that say I don't. But I resemble Grant. And maybe depending on how you catch me, I might look more like Grant one time than another. But my position is that I resemble General Grant or President Grant. I've been asked, and doing President Grant, are you going to gain weight? Because, see, Grant gained about 60 pounds in the White House. He went in weighing 150 and he left weighing well over 200 pounds. The $50 bill, and for you folks in the UK, that's a relic that we folks in the US hardly ever see anymore. It's a $50 bill. It's a rare thing. I never see one, but I understand Grant's picture's on one. But the picture on a 50 was from a photograph taken of him right at the end of his term. He was ending his presidential term because they weren't going to put out a bill with the sitting president. And that picture shows him probably at his heaviest, and he's weighing in at about 210. I weigh 155 pounds. Am I going to put on 50 pounds? No, thank you. I did think, I gave some serious thought to buying a fat suit, because I could go to a theatrical supply and buy a suit that, of course, you can't see any further than chest here, but I could buy a fat suit for a man of 215, 10 pounds. But then if I did that, my neck and face would not be commensurate in size. And I'd have to buy another one of those suits to go over that fat suit thing. And I don't want to spend that. I won't go into what they cost, but they're all tailor-made specifically. And I don't want to have to spend that kind of money. So just as when you listen to me, you got to listen to me, not an affected accent, which I don't need to do anyway, I found out. And you're going to have to look at me at 155 or to 150 pounds in the presidential suit. I'm not going to gain 60 pounds.
Jonathan would like to know, are you a natural horseman or have you trained to be the great horseman as General Grant?
No, I am not a natural horseman. People frequently ask me, do you have a horse? No. I drew the line. I drew the line. No horse. I'd love to have a horse, but let me see. A horse is going to run me what a horse has cost, $1,000, $2,000. And when you buy the horse, you got to board him, and that costs every month. You got to take care of him. You got vet bills. You got to buy a trailer. And so, if you give a mouse a cookie thing that you keep on, I'd wind up having thousands of dollars or hundreds, if not thousands of pounds in a horse. And I would rarely ride him. As it has turned out, I've frequently been at events and people always have horses. And they always offer me a horse. I've never been to an event. And it's hard to say ever, never, and always, because ever, never, and always don't always apply. There are always exceptions. But I've never been to an event where there were horses that somebody didn't approach me and say, General, would you like to ride the horse? Yes, of course. I am not a natural rider, but I can ride. And I tell people when I get on a horse, I tell them I can ride, but I'm not a rider. And there's a distinction. I can ride, but I'm not a rider. And if we're going to be out on this horse, I like to have the owner of the horse where that horse can see him. Because see, horses are funny animals. They're real funny animals. They're herd animals, and they want to be with their stable mates. They want to be with their buddies. They don't like new and strange things. And horses are real docile if they know they're with somebody that they know. So whenever I ride a horse, and I always never turn it down, I like to ride a horse, but I always make it very clear, I want the owner of this horse right here beside me. So Trigger here knows he's in good hands, because horses also know when the person sitting on them is not an adept horseman. They sense that. And they don't like people on them that they don't know. Horses have to know you. So it's okay if they don't, and I'm happy to ride. But I'm not a natural horseman. I can ride. I enjoy it. But when I do, I always have the owner. Like at Appomattox, if you watch the video on YouTube about the surrender at Appomattox, I'm going to tell you a little inside. The fellow riding beside me, I hope you go back and watch this now, as we approach the gate there at Appomattox, I'm riding Captain. And Bill Fuchsia, who is a retired B-52 bomber pilot, and then he had a career as a sheriff's deputy up in Washington, not far from you, Mike, there on the coast, 25 years as a sheriff's deputy. Now he and his wife moved back to Virginia, where they originally lived. But the guy riding beside me with a big, beautiful mustache, very distinguished looking man, Bill Fuchsia, he was riding Captain, Yankee, his horse, and also his horse, Captain, and I'm on Captain. So when we rode up to that gate, watch the film. There are several thousand people there gathered around that house. And the cameras are rolling. This is going global. That was a global broadcast. And we ride to that house, that gate, and I'm fine. I stayed fine. But when we got to that gate, that's about standard width of the gate, 48 inches maybe, Captain didn't want to go through that gate. And I looked over a bit, and of course, you can't tell this because I watched it. you can't tell this, and there's no panic, but the protocol says that the general goes through that gate first, not the support staff officer. I think Bill was a colonel. Well, he was a general, but the ranking officer, I go through the gate first. Horse wouldn't go through the gate. I spurred him a little bit gently, because I didn't want him bucking and running off. Captain wasn't going through that gate. So Bill, I glanced over at him and he said, here, let me go through first. And he said, nobody heard it. And so he put the little spur to Yankee, and Yankee, Captain stablemate, Yankee went through that gate first. Well, when Yankee went through, Captain was fine with it. So then I rode through the gate behind him. Now, that's a little behind the scenes for you when you watch that, but there was a couple of seconds there of what are we going to do now? This is live TV, global TV, folks, but it's exemplary of horses need to know who's on them and who's around them. Next question.
All right. MJ says, I believe the historical person picks the living historian to portray them. Would you think that Grant perhaps chose you to tell his story?
I'd truly like to think so. The initial impetus or thought for me to do Grant was, as I said, it was something from above that hit me all at once. I had known all of those facts, obviously, because they're all true. You may check. But when it was over, I thought, how in the world do I know that Grant's the most photographed man in the world, and Lincoln's the third, and Frederick Douglass is number two? I'd read it sometime, somewhere. How did I know that Lincoln and Grant never had a photograph together? And I've had many people over the years come back and email me and say, you're right. I didn't believe you when you told me, but I've checked. You're right. There weren't any photographs of them. Things like that. There was no initiation of thought on my part. I just wanted a picture with a fellow that looked like President Lincoln. So it came to me in a providential manner. And am I channeling Grant? Sometimes I have it flows so easily for me. When, however you may think for Grant, I do no conscious thought of anything except to watch the cadence of my speech. That's the only thing. And maybe I'm channeling Grant. I sure hope so, because it comes so easily. I retain about Grant so easily. So maybe I don't claim channeling, but maybe there's a connection. I hope someday I get to meet him and ask him. I'd love to have Ulysses S. Grant say, Curt, you did a great job. You made me look good.
All right. So Richard says, happy birthday to you and General Grant. And Sharon says, we have greatly enjoyed your reflections and wanted to know what you consider the best biography of Grant.
My favorite biographies, my personal Curt's favorites, are in equal ranking: Grant by Gene Edward Smith, and American Ulysses by Ron White, and right up there with them on the same bookshelf, Grant by Turno, and let me see, the annotated version of the Ulysses S. Grant's personal memoirs that were put out by the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library back in 2018, and it is absolutely wonderful. I urge you, if you have any interest in Grant, get the annotated memoirs, because they reference every person, place, or event that Grant mentions in his memoirs. And that, I hasten to add, that is not to make you say, oh God, how long must that book be? It's not that at all. You can read the memoirs, and when he refers to person, place, event, or thing, you can look at the end of that chapter, and it's there in detail, and then you can go even further. It completely doubles the value and content of the book. And the last book, I would say, is The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant by Charles W. Calhoun, Calhoun. I was fortunate enough, I've been fortunate enough to meet Ron White, Ron Chernow, and Chuck Calhoun. It's not like we hang together, but I've met them. You know, we're a little more than acquainted, but we're not buddies. All of them are wonderful men. And I talked to Chuck Calhoun. Now, I am so enamored of The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant that I told Chuck Calhoun when I met him down at Mississippi State at the Presidential Library, where he made a presentation. I said, you have written the third volume of Grant's memoirs. The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant by Charles W. Calhoun is the third volume of Grant's 2-volume memoirs, because Grant, and I'd like to throw this in, it's not Curt, but throw this in. I asked Chuck, I was so fortunate at a dinner at John Marzalec's home, who's the executive director of the PL, the Presidential Library, and so forth. There were several of us there, and I literally got to sit at the right hand, and I was able. I struggled not to monopolize him, but I asked him, what about a Grant not wanting a third term, or did he want a third term? And he said he did want a third term. I thought my perception had been that he didn't like being a president, and that's completely erroneous. He reveled in being a president, and he really did want a third term. And I asked him, why didn't Grant mention the presidency other than I was elected the president of the United States twice? That's all he says about it. Out of 1,200 pages, 263,000 words, 70 chapters, and 2 volumes. And there's one sentence that he refers to the presidency. And Chuck came back and said, it's because, think about it, Curt, Grant knew he was dying. He didn't even begin the memoirs until he'd been diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. It was cancer at the base of the tongue. And by the time he died, he was down to 90 pounds, and he had a tumor on the right side of his throat that was the size of a grapefruit. So when you see those pictures of him on the porch at the cottage, those last few that they took, he's got that white scarf. That's to cover that mammoth tumor. He couldn't turn his head, it was so big. But Grant, the reason Grant wrote the memoirs was because he was broke, and he was about to die and leave Julia destitute. He was writing the memoirs to write a book that he hoped would sell. He didn't think it would, but he hoped it would sell. And he knew that if he wanted the book to sell, what are people going to want to read about him and the war? And that's what he wrote about, because he knew he probably didn't have enough time to get into the presidency. And that's why he didn't address the presidency. And as it turned out, he laid down the pencil on July the 16th of 1885 there at the Grant Cottage in Wilton, New York. And he said, I've done all I can do. I can't write anymore. I've already added 50 pages. I didn't think I'd have time to write. And he died on July 23rd, or July the 19th, he finished it. And he died July 23rd. So he didn't have time to address the presidency. But Chuck Calhoun took 7 years to research and write The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. And it is profound. It's a great book. Can't recommend it highly enough. It is the third volume of Grant's memoirs. So my favorites, Curt's favorites, Grant by Gene Edward Smith, American Ulysses by Ron White, Grant by Ron Chernow, and Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant by Charles W. Calhoun, and the annotated memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, published by Harvard University, but written by edited by John Marszalek, Louis P. Gallo, and David Nolan.
Wow. Cheryl says, doing living history is so rewarding.
It is. It is.
Doreen says, you are a special person, Curt. I have enjoyed all of the Fridays with Grant, and you have made that special.
Thank you, Doreen. That is special. That means a great deal.
And Jerry says, likewise, it has been a great honor and blessing for me to present President Lincoln.
You do a good job, Jerry.
You know, we have another maybe 30 questions and comments.
You want to do this again? You want to do redux with this? I'd be happy to.
I think that we should do a redo of this in after the redux of the war years. But let's end with Sergeant Major's question. Tell us all about Scott Thomas and his partnership with you and Lincoln Generals.
Well, Scott Thomas was a very special fellow. I'll send you, Jerry, a photograph of Scott and myself, and we can show that next time. But Scott, I met him when he came down to Shiloh in 2012 for the 150th. He and another fellow came down from Lincoln's Generals. I'm a member of Lincoln's Generals, and they had Mike Seeley out of Florida had suggested that I joined Lincoln's Generals, and I applied, and they turned me down. And I said, okay, I'm all right with that. I was young in the program, and then they split away. They were with the Confederation of Union Generals, CUG, which is a strong group, and they do a good job. But some of the guys wanted to break away from CUG and form Lincoln's Generals. And Scott Thomas, who was also a retired Air Force major and was a B-52 bomber pilot, and I think Scott flew fighters, brilliant genius of a man, big redheaded guy, and the most knowledgeable man I've ever met in things Civil War, military protocol. But he and the other fellow came down to Shiloh to check me out. And I didn't know it, but I was auditioning. And I had gone out and pitched my tent there on the field. Well, I did it on the Friday afternoon before the event. And I came back in Saturday morning, and one of the organizers says, General, your tent's been moved. And I said, who, what, and why, and where? And he said, well, these two guys came in and said, they don't like your tent over there. Let's put it over here. And I said, well, I said a couple of things, Sherman-esque, and said, where are these gentlemen that I may speak with them? And they were right over there. And he said, I'm vacating the area. And so I went over there, and I'm in uniform, and Scott comes up to me, as I recall. He come up, stuck out that big hand and said, oh, General, you're General Grant. I'd know you anywhere. As Secretary of War Stanton would say, and I found out later, I knew then, but I found out more later about that's what Stanton had said to him. And the other fellow was there. And so Scott says, you may wonder why we moved your tent. And I said, I was going to get into that and probably into your shorts about moving it without me knowing it. And he said, not to worry. You see, the reason we moved it, it wasn't in a good place. And I said, well, why don't you leave that up to me to decide whether my tent's in place or not? Who are you? And he said, well, we're from CUG and Lincoln's Generals. And he said, the reason we moved it was because they told you to put it over there. We got here this morning. Other things have come up. The vendors or have come in, and your tent should be facing the company street, and that's why we moved it. And I said, well, okay, now you're telling me why, and I appreciate it. So Scott and I became really good friends. He had the most knowledge about the war and the military of anyone I've ever met in the experience. I don't call it a hobby. A lot of people do, and that's fine. I call it the experience, because to me, it's much more than a hobby. But Scott was so profoundly knowledgeable about the war and about everybody in the war and about everything from buttoning buttons in button position to the flag proper display of whose flag ought to be where, on, down to the sub-molecular level. He was always my go-to guy, and just a wonderful, wonderful man. And, you know, that's my connection. Cancer took him. And that is all I have to say about it. I could go on at length about Scott, but I deeply miss him. He was my go-to guy. If you ever wonder, well, where does Curt go? Well, I always went to Scott Thomas. Wonderful man.
All right. So thank you very much, Curt. This has been I think a very valuable session, and we certainly will redo it. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2 weeks, we're going to be doing the redux of the war years, and you shall receive, when you sign up, the typical email, but on that email will be a link that you can click to get all of the questions that were asked during the first session. And we're going to do that same thing with the upcoming behind the curtain redux. So look carefully at your email when you get it. Click that link, download the PDF of the questions, and be prepared, as the Boy Scouts would say.
I have 2 comments. First of all, I want to recognize the Cumberland Mountain Civil War Roundtable in Crossville, Tennessee. I was up there night before last, and they have opened up. They're having meetings again, and there were more than 120 people at that meeting. That I was floored to see that many people. And I have to say, it was the 3rd time I've been there, so they knew what they were going to get, and they still came. But 120 plus. Crossville is a small town in rural East Tennessee, about an hour west of Knoxville, Tennessee. My point is, wherever you may be, you can have a strong and healthy Civil War roundtable. And location has very little to do with it. It's the people that get together and drive it. And Ken Patton and the Hand, Mark Paffenroth, I'm always pleased to have the Hand join us. The Hand is ubiquitous. And in fact, I've even got pictures on my Facebook page about the Hand actually getting to hold my crutch. That was an honor. I let the Hand hold my crutch. But the Cumberland Mountain Civil War Roundtable are a special bunch of folks. The Hampton Road Civil War Roundtable, they told me the biggest crowd that they've ever had when I was there last week. So the humility is profoundly impressed upon me. And also, I'd like to encourage everybody to send a few bucks to the Civil War Roundtable, Congress of Civil War Roundtables, because, and Mike doesn't know I was going to do this, but if all of you sent $10, a sawbuck, with 120 plus people tonight, that's a lot of money for Mike to use to further what the Civil War Roundtable Congress is doing. So I'm not advocating write a big check. I'm just saying, think of many hands make light work, and think if all of you just wrote a $10 check, how much money that would bring in to help further what you're being able to enjoy tonight. And I'm just one of a host of folks that do better presentations and tell you better things than what I do. So send Mike $10 and tell him Grant told me to. You got your orders? Good night.
Thank you, Curt. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great evening, and thank you very much for being here with Fridays with Grant.
Good night.
Good night.